We're on to the last of the 3 steps for the last step for the Colombo technique. So again, determine what the other person believes. Step 2, get the reason for the belief. Step 3a, use a question, show the view is self-defeating. Step 3b, take the point to its absurd conclusion. And the last one is you need to understand more. You need to dig underneath this. And so you use questions. In some cases, you use questions to learn more, or you could use questions to point out weaknesses. There is something that Greg Koukl points out that's called the professor's ploy. And remember, the person making the claim must defend it. So if the professor says the Bible is full of fables, you have to be careful in the response. And you can respond with a question. Remember, a professor is there to answer your question. So in some sense, it's his job. And so you can ask questions. The professor says the Bible is full of fables. You could ask, sir, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, he could respond by not answering the question. He could say, I'll bet you're a Bible-believing Christian. Why don't you explain why the Bible is inerrant? Now, this is interesting because he made a statement. You asked him a question about that statement. What has he done? Well, he's tried to turn the focus on you. And he's avoided answering your question. So this is called a distraction. Well, how do you respond? Well, you want to point out, well, this sort of response is appropriate. Sir, I haven't told you my beliefs. Remember, he made an accusation. You don't have to respond yes or no to that accusation. You can just say, I haven't told you my beliefs. You want to get back to your original question. I'm just trying to understand how you arrived at your conclusion. You made the claim the Bible is full of fables, and I would just like to understand your evidence. So don't take the bait. He baited you. He tried to distract you to get off topic. And you rightfully decided not to take the bait. Remember, the person making the claim needs to defend it. Okay. So now we'll talk about 3C, and we'll go through some statements, and we'll talk about some responses. Hopefully you're seeing the pattern. They said there's just a strong probability that God doesn't exist. This is a statement that Richard Dawkins made in the, what was that? Expelled was the DVD. That's what it was. You can ask, well, how strong is that probability? You know, try and pick a number. Is it between 50 and 70, 70 and 90, 90 and 100? And then if they pick a number, the next question is, well, why pick that value and not another probability? You know, just picking a probability isn't good enough. You need to have a reason for picking that probability. An interesting comment here is that there's something called Bayes' theorem, which talks about probability and historicity. And it turns out probability is based on something called background knowledge. You know, if I'm a pro golfer and I have a history of hitting hole-in-ones, then you may hear that I hit a hole-in-one. And that may not be so remarkable. Now, if I was a quadriplegic and you heard I hit a hole-in-one, well, that may have a very low probability. And so my point there is that what you know about my background or the background of the circumstances helps you to understand what that probability is. So probability is based on background knowledge. You ask the question, what background knowledge is used to calculate this probability? Again, digging into the details. Can God create a rock so big you can't move? This is one of those things you find on the internet. Again, you can ask a question, isn't that a nonsense question like one hand clapping? Well, why are we saying that? Well, you ask the question, isn't that like asking, can God win an arm wrestling match with himself? You're trying to highlight sort of the absurdity of that question. And you could say, are you asking, can God's omnipotence defeat his omnipotence? Right? Can God beat up God? Is sort of the, the crass way of saying this. Number 3, You might not hear this much, but you can't prove the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist. So your argument that I can't disprove God is invalid. Well, in some ways this is an admission of their weak position, but they're hiding it. You could ask, then you agree with me that you should be an atheist and not an agnostic and not an atheist? Or, more technically, doesn't the impossibility of being unable to prove a universal negative show your position is logically weak? You could ask if my argument is invalid, what premise is wrong, or what rules of logic was misapplied. Here we're dealing with a touchy subject. When we read Genesis 1, we have to recognize that when it talks about the 7 days of creation, that is not a matter of salvation, nor is it a matter of being in or out of the Christian faith. And so I prefer to deal with this in a way that just provides for many alternative answers to this particular question. The question is, how is it that the Bible explains the earth to be 6,000 to 8,000 years old when you know that dinosaur bones are at least 65 million years old? This person actually has a pretty good question, because he may have Christian friends who say the earth is young, it's only 10,000 years old. But he's told by scientific periodicals, textbooks, that dinosaurs are at least 65 million years old, so there's a discrepancy. Now, irregardless of your personal opinion about whether it was a 24-hour day or not, I think this is a way to not impose your belief on the person and yet respond. So you may ask, what is meant by the phrase or term day? Is it a literal 24 hours or a long period of time? And I bring this up because the word day can mean many things. It can mean a literal 24 hours. It can mean part of 24 hours. And then there's this more generic term we use, where we use it in particular contexts. We say, in my grandpa's day. In your grandpa's day may be 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. It could be a long period of time. But it's some sort of referred to period. And so this is one way of getting out of that. You may have to find other sources. I believe John Lennox has a book, 7 Days That Changed the World, that I found pretty interesting. Number 5, God wants everyone to worship and follow him, and if they don't, they burn in hell for all eternity. What does this type of attitude say about his character? Now, there's an accusation in here that God is unjust. Well, you have to ask a question. What do you expect from a being that is holy and perfect? And what we're trying to do is to show the person that the judgment scale he's using is his own. It may not be the same judgment scale that God uses. Ray Comfort might prefer this kind of response, which is, why should God let murderers, adulterers, and blasphemers into his perfect heaven? Right? Going to heaven is not a right. And there are certain characteristics. Why would God send people to hell? Well, I think this is an appropriate question. Is it God sending people to hell, or people are choose to go to hell? Think about that. If God created a perfect world, then where did evil and pain come from? Again, if the person is in an emotional, painful state, do not respond with logic. But if this is sort of a logical question, then you say, well, did God create a perfect world or a good world? God claimed it was good, not perfect. And that word good is actually a term that can mean different things. I've read, and I can't reproduce the source, that the goodness there was not necessarily a physical goodness, it was a moral goodness. So you could ask, was the goodness a material goodness or a moral goodness? And there's an accusation possibly in here too, in that God messed up. Well, as Christians, we don't believe necessarily God messed up. We believe Adam messed up. He asks the question, who was it that sinned in the Garden of Eden, and what was the effect? Well, Adam sinned, And the effect was the fall of creation. Here's question 8. If God is omnipotent, why does he not just show himself to all of us all at once? Well, could there be a purpose behind the hiddenness of God? Number 9. If God created everything, why did he create AIDS, influenza, Ebola, E. coli, and so on and so on? Well, why do you think God created these diseases? And what I mean by that is, we do know that the world around us is degenerating. And we do know that bacteria and viruses can change. And it may have been these were not necessarily harmful at the origin of creation, but they became harmful as they evolved. And more pointedly, are these diseases described at the beginning of creation? Like, can you point to where God created the diseases? Let's not accuse God of something that he never claimed to do. What about the native in Africa who's never heard? Well, there's an accusation there that God is being unjust. And so they're impinging on the character of God. So I want to ask the question, wouldn't a perfect God judge perfectly? I don't worry about the native in Africa who's never heard, because I trust that God has all knowledge. He's holy, he's all just, and he will make the correct judgment. With my limited knowledge, how can I judge? And more pointedly, if people are judged according to what they know, then how will you be judged? Let's not worry about the native in Africa, sir. We're here, you have knowledge, you'll be judged according to that knowledge. How do you think you'll be judged? Here's another one you'll find on the internet by the zealous atheists. Was God immoral for murdering the Canaanites? Well, there's a couple of questions or words that need to be defined there, but what do you mean by immoral? And why is it wrong for God to stop evil? Why is God wrong for stopping an evil culture? The Canaanites were a perverse culture. They sacrificed their firstborn children on a statue that had a fire underneath it, and the children burned to death. That's just an instance. And more importantly, if we talk about the question of murder, what does it mean for God to murder? If God is the giver of life, can he not take it? And really, when somebody's murdered, if Christianity is true, it's not that they cease to exist, it's that they just cease to be here. They go somewhere else. So the question is, why is it wrong for God to take life if he gives it? Is that murder?